I try to avoid cables that have connectors like this. Let's talk about mic cables. I was recently talking with a friend of mine who was shopping for a microphone cable, and he contacted me because he said, Barry, I've been shopping for mic cables and I see that there is an enormous price range. Some are just a few dollars and some are like $50 or more. And then there's some of these reference cables that are like really expensive. And are they all the same? And which one do I need? What difference does it make? Let me break down what's important to me when purchasing microphone cables. One thing I keep in mind is that all of the cables, in terms of the context in which I'm using them, will sound the same. If they make a quality electrical connection, they're all going to sound the same. But the difference is in the construction quality and the materials. And I figure that a replacement 3-pin Canon XLR type connector, like one of those, is about a $5 or $6 part. And so if I can purchase a cable for about that price, well, that's a pretty good clue to me that they're probably not using quite that level of quality parts to construct the cable. And so I try to avoid the very bottom end because the super inexpensive mic cables probably don't use the same quality connectors or the same quality of wire as the more expensive cables do, and I don't want to risk having a failure during the show. I don't want to have cables that when I mate them together don't make good, solid, tight electrical connections. I like to have my cables, when I put them together, have them mate nicely and click and be secure and not have any kind of mechanical issues. And sometimes you experience those problems when you buy cables with the really least expensive connectors that are out there. So I try to avoid that. On the other hand, there are some cables that are very pricey, $50 and up. And then there's a segment of the market which are extraordinarily expensive audio cables. And I see this more so in the home hi-fi business than I do in the pro audio side, but nevertheless, there are some cables out there that are just ridiculously expensive. And I tend to think that the benefits of that tier of cable are more religious in nature than scientific. And so I don't think that that's a particularly good value proposition. Now, obviously, if you purchase really expensive, high-quality stuff, you're rewarded with high-quality materials and workmanship. And if money's no object to you, that's a decision you can make. But that's not the place where I'm living. And so I choose cables which are somewhere in the mid-market. I avoid the really, really least expensive foreign-made cables because I am suspect of the quality of the connectors, the quality of the interconnection between the wires and those connectors, and some of the wire material that they use just isn't as rugged. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all wire is equal in terms of carrying signal either. The longer the cable runs, like over 100 foot, and the higher the frequencies that I'm expecting that cable to handle, for example, if the cable is going to be handling high-speed digital data, that can be pretty challenging to carry over an extended piece of wire, and then the specifications of that wire start getting increasingly important. But if I'm carrying an audio signal for 15, 20, 50 feet, that's not super demanding on wire. And so most any reasonable audio signal cable will carry that just fine. So I look for cables that just seem like they are mechanically well built and that have good quality connectors on them and will be rugged enough to survive multiple shows. And so you don't have to spend a whole lot of money in order to achieve that. I purchased a lot of cables from the internet for under $10 a piece that have served me well. And at that price point, if I have a problem with a cable, I don't have any problem just unplugging it and throwing it into my box of suspect wires, grabbing a fresh one, and moving on. At $50 per mic cable, hurts a lot if a cable gets damaged. And so I don't think that that's a real great value proposition, those really expensive cables. Now, another thing that I look for is, as you're aware, these 3-pin XLR type audio cables, these balanced cables, are locking cables, so that when you put them together, they lock into place with each other and they won't easily come disconnected unless you push the little release button on the female side, and then the cable comes apart like so. And in the case of a chassis mount connector, when I plug this into the chassis, there's a little button usually above the connector which you need to depress in order to release the male cable out of the chassis, such as the stage snake box or the back of a mixer or something like that. There's a couple different styles of these male XLR connectors that are common. And here. Clunk. This style is a continuous shell all the way around. You can see it's all continuous. And on the inside where the pins are, there is a little ridge cut that the hook on the chassis mount connector or the mating connector hooks into and catches to keep the connectors locked in place. This style, on the other hand, has a hole instead of a ridge that's cut on the inside of that shell. This one has a hole that goes all the way through the shell that, again, the same hook will click into to retain the cable when it's pushed in and locked in place. I've had a couple of experiences with connectors where I've plugged a cable into its mating jack and the cable would not release afterwards. You push the release button and you pull the cable out, or you try to pull the cable out, but it doesn't completely release, and it doesn't want to release the cable. Now, in almost all of those instances, I've been able to just wiggle around the connector a little bit, push and pull on it, and tug it from different little directions. And a whole lot of force is usually not a good remedy to it, but after a little bit of shaking and wiggling, you can usually get the thing out. Sometimes you can slip a knife point or a small screwdriver in alongside the connector and try to nudge it out of there. But I've found that these connectors that have a hole in the shell sometimes will capture the connecting hook and make it difficult for me to remove these connectors from the chassis or from the mating connector. I have fewer of those instances with the type of connectors that do not have the hole that goes all the way through the shell. So if I have a choice when buying cables, I try to avoid the ones that have the hole that go all the way through. Just a quick tip for you. So folks, like I say, as long as the cable is mechanically strong enough and well manufactured enough that it'll endure the kind of abuse it'll take during your shows, and the connectors make good, solid, clean electrical connections, they all sound the same. And so don't overspend. I wouldn't spend $30 or $50 on a mic cable if I didn't have to. And don't underspend and get the really inexpensive ones that might cause you trouble during your shows. And beyond that, I think it's a commodity item. So that's my thoughts on mic cables, and I hope that you spend your money wisely on gear and get equipment that serves you well and reliably and helps you put on some great shows. My name is Barry. I'm a sound engineer in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and I'm glad that you stuck around and watched another episode of Sound Advice. I would encourage you to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button so that you're notified of more content when it comes down, and I hope you take the opportunity to see the next episode when it's released. Thanks again, folks. We'll see you soon.